Being MIT CISA Research, we will start by thanking the research sponsors. What I really am pleased by is there's a good percentage of these global research sponsors are actually Australian organisations. I used to head up strategy and architecture at Westpac about 15 years ago. Westpac was a research sponsor and still is. I then moved to RBA as the CIO. RBA is a research sponsor. There's some great organisations, including I know a number in this room that participate in this research. And if you're ever interested in participating in the research, reach out. Some really interesting learnings to be had. We did interview about 35 separate organisations in the first phase of this research. We're actually continuing the research now, and we'll have more to share probably in the next 6 months. The nature of ecosystems is they are very complex and they are diverse, and often they span organisational but also national boundaries. And so we've gone to pretty much most of the major continents and regions and talked to organisations of all variety and shape and nature, and some of them are shared up there. We've also spoken to a lot of different positions, CEOs, CIOs, chief digital officers, but product officers as well, individual SMEs, researchers as well. So we've gone to a pretty broad pool of people to form some of these views. So, governance, my favourite topic. I looked after governance for technology at Westpac 15 or so years ago. I looked after technology governance at the RBA, and then leaned into how technology governance for things like the new payments platform and core banking infrastructure worked across the economy. And so that was fascinating. And then I got really interested when we decentralized governance, and all of a sudden you started seeing Web3, blockchain-based systems actually disrupting the status quo. And so that's where I took a particular interest. And this research spans some emerging findings from all of those spaces. But let's start with the statement that governance is hard. And in business, if you get it wrong, you will fail. And if I think about all the things that come up, we talked, on the panel before, we're talking about board engagement and AI governance, ethical governance, risk governance, data governance. These are the sorts of things that make or break an organization. They underpin the success of ecosystems, particularly digital ecosystems. And then the question and the challenge comes when you try to expand that beyond an organization, it's almost exponentially harder. Because at least within an organization, there is a degree of authority and the buck stops with some people. But when you're working sometimes with competitors or hopefully collaborators, it's much more uncertain around where the governance rights sit. Where are the accountabilities? How do you deal with disputes and contentions? And often these are the things that make ecosystem collaborations fail. And so we looked into that. Interestingly for me, and I love the ADAPT analysis, and you all contribute to this when you respond to the surveys. But for me, a very interesting thing has happened over the last 2 or 3 years. I found it interesting, we talked about the bias drift just before in models. Post-COVID, a lot of the data that informed the way consumers, individuals, organizations behaved were turned on their head. And the models that now dictate how people and parties engage in the economy and across ecosystems has shifted. And one thing that's an outcome of that is a shift in preference and value opportunity out of ecosystems. It's something we've been talking about for many years. Some of you will know Peter Weil. Peter, a mentor of mine, the director and head of the Centre for Information Systems Research at MIT Sloan, very familiar to a lot of Australian organisations and boards. And he's been a prominent proponent of the shift towards ecosystems over the last decade. In the last 2 years, we're now seeing ecosystem growth, increasingly the largest provider of revenue for organizations. And I think if you look at the way we digitally construct our businesses, it makes sense. I work at Salesforce. Salesforce, some of you will know, increasingly now runs on AWS, Hyperforce, which is an instantiation of Salesforce tech on AWS infrastructure. In turn, a lot of big organizations, billion-dollar businesses, run on the Salesforce platform. They themselves have lots of businesses that run on their platforms. And so you've got this stratification of platforms. Salesforce runs on AWS, nCino, some of you will be familiar with that big company in the banking space, it runs on Salesforce. nCino has a whole host of platforms and parties that work on top of nCino. And so you actually have an ecosystem of providers, and the revenue of the success of one is dependent on collaboration with others. Increasingly, when we look at the products and the services we offer, particularly those that are digitally enabled or delivered, they are in fact a function of ecosystem collaboration. a whole chain of multi-party relationships. Very different to even 3, 4, 5, 6 years ago, where it's largely supplier and buyer, a lot of bi-directional, bilateral relationships. As we've exited COVID and we've gone all in on digital, one of the outcomings of that is digital ecosystems. So in addition to growing value, something else that was very interesting from the research that we looked at was the tendency for ecosystems to be particularly good when there was a collaboration in place at focusing on wicked problems. And these are those challenges which can't really be solved by one particular organization. I'll put a few examples up. Frauds and scams, climate change solutions, cyber threats and vulnerabilities. We talked about frictions before, supply chain frictions. These are the sorts of things where even with all your best intentions and every dollar and every individual hour that you can throw at it from your own organization, you are not as an organization empowered to solve some of these challenges. It actually requires multiple parties, multiple collaborators, sometimes competitors, to actually get together and solve and work on the solutions to address these issues. So what we're finding is that ecosystems increasingly are particularly well harnessed to attack those wicked challenges which historically have been really intractable and impossible for individual organizations to solve. And when you look at some of the recent announcements in the market around fraud and scam solutions between big telco providers and banks and retailers, it's perhaps not a coincidence that they are collaborating, they are sharing information, I heard that mentioned before, and they are collectively working on solutions to problems that previously individually they could not attack. And so I guess the question or the opportunity for all of us here is to think about how can we start looking at those problems which perhaps we've struggled to address. Some of those examples are up here. And maybe we're better off actually collaborating, sometimes with competitors, to actually tackle some of these issues. Individually, we've failed. Collectively, we can succeed. I want to give you an example. I talked to the head of ecosystem business at Bayer in South America, Leo Bastos. Now, about 18 months ago, Bayer, you'll know them as a big pharmaceutical company, they also have a massive agricultural and agribusiness where they do a lot of chemical fertilizer production. They've got a fantastic case study, one of the best I've seen, where what they've done is they've had a platform for some time, Foreground, and what Foreground does is it actually works with their farmers. It's in South America now, it's going into North America. It basically asks farmers to provide a lot of instrumentized data on the state of the soil and the state of their productive lands. And they give that information to Bayer. Bayer loves that because then they can actually look at the state of the soil and come up with very targeted dosages of fertilizers for specific parts of those fields, which they can then sell back to the farmer. Now you think, well, what's in it for the farmer? What they have done, which is brilliant, is they have then partnered with financial carbon credit organizations to actually take that data and turn it into tradable carbon credits, which they then give back to the farmer. For some of these farmers now, 30 to 40% of the revenue from their land is actually coming from carbon credits, which are actually productized from the data that they themselves give to Bayer. And so Bayer is actually earning from the receipt of that information. They've created an incentive flywheel to actually encourage the data to be given to them. They're giving money back to the farmer in return for that data. But what Bayer have now done is they've actually partnered with a host of other organizations, satellite imagery companies, farming manufacturing companies, to actually allow them all to touch into that platform and actually start exchanging value across the participants. It's a win-win-win-win-win-win scenario, and it's creating a massive flywheel of economic value. Ecosystem solutions to problems that previously weren't addressed by any individual party. Really good example of an ecosystem growing value. Yet, and I think historically, the vast majority of examples that we looked at, and there's been some quite prominent Australian ones, were failures. A good example, I think, that's starting to get more scrutiny is Maersk. Some of you will know Maersk is the world's largest shipping organization. A number of years ago, they worked with IBM to launch a massive blockchain-based solution to actually create transparent information flows around shipping information. There's a lot of friction and a lot of inefficiencies in moving items across various ports around the world. Interestingly enough, it failed, even though at one point in time a massive amount of global shipping was on the platform. But the reason it failed was not because of the technology. It was not a blockchain failure. It was not a scalability failure. It's not a performance failure. The reason it failed was actually a collaboration failure. And it was interesting in the interviews that we did, and if you look at actually some of the public commentary from leadership of Maersk around the reason of the failure, it was this quote: "The lack of the ability for full global industry collaboration has not been achieved." And so it was a collaboration failure, a classic ecosystem fault. And so what were our findings? We looked at a lot of organizations, and these were the reasons that fundamentally led to ecosystem collaborations failing. The value created was outweighed by the investment and the risk. So inherently, I gave the Bayer example before. If you added up the value across all the participants, it didn't actually outweigh the investment that was required to get that platform. Classic business case failure. Next one's an interesting one: a lack of trust in a single party to govern on behalf of others. I think this was a huge theme that we saw. When one dominant organization had a great idea to get everyone else, including customers, but also maybe competitors, onto a platform, one of the key reasons we found that over time that ecosystem play failed was because the participants, particularly the competitors, didn't trust the big gorilla to run the platform. They were very fearful of giving up their sensitive, sometimes confidential information, and they weren't sure how it was going to be managed and treated by ultimately their biggest competitor. And that fundamentally was one of the core faults with the Maersk incident. That reliance on a single party that wasn't trusted actually broke the collaboration trust model. I heard trust mentioned earlier, and that was critical. Participants increasingly are upset if they feel like they're investing in something but they're not getting any benefits. So often, a classic example, we've seen some examples in Australia. We had a major failure in one of the big marketplace solutions that was implemented recently, where a lot of the financial beneficiaries said all the cost seems to be getting spread amongst all of us participants, but all the benefits seem to be going to the gorilla and the party that actually initiated the project in the first place. We're paying for their centralized solution to now be decentralized, and we're wearing costs that we previously didn't have to wear. So cost distribution is another failure reason. Misalignment of company goals, that's a classic one, perhaps not surprising. A low transparency which reduces trust among participants. This was a huge one where we found that when you've got multiple parties working together, if there's not a transparent flow of information, we talked about data sharing before, state of health of the ecosystem. Where is the value going? What are the margins? What are the profit levels? What are the revenue flows? And how are they being distributed? How are the costs being distributed? If that wasn't transparent, what we found over time is trust eroded. And then importantly, and this was a key one in many cases, if there were concerns about the confidentiality of data being put onto an ecosystem platform, then that often led to, after maybe initial dallying with that platform, a withdrawal from the platform. One thing we found, and I'll touch on this in an example that was close to my heart, the new payments platform in Australia. Regulator participation in the platform is a really good way of encouraging confidence in participation. Because if participants know that a regulator's involved, they trust that the other participants will behave. And so that was a key lesson that we had, is sometimes there's an incentive to get the regulator into your ecosystem play or solution, because it actually raises trust amongst all the other participants. So some interesting findings. So this gets to the heart of the recommendations that we had. How do you drive ecosystem success? And the key observation for us is getting your governance right is key. You can do alpha governance right. Alpha is the model where we have a single dominant provider, but the key requirement in this case is that that party that actually makes the decisions. We saw that was about the middle ground in the results that you all played back earlier. That party needs to be trusted to act on the behalf of the entire ecosystem. And so they need to demonstrate that they're investing in the ecosystem, putting money back in, wearing the costs, not earning unreasonable profits, or at least making sure that the profits are distributed amongst all. In those conditions, being the gorilla in the room will still actually succeed. Often, though, it doesn't happen because that gorilla can be not trusted. They're not giving enough back to the ecosystem. One that's actually becoming increasingly popular, it was really interesting to see the results before, because I think it was the dominant result in this room for the respondent surveys, which is the first time we've seen that, is this emergence of representative governance, where you, as an ecosystem participant, you could be a retailer, a manufacturer, you could be a bank, a fintech, telco, you actually welcome some of your collaborators, including your competitors, into the governance of the scheme that you're running. That takes a huge judgment, because what you're doing is you're giving up control. You're giving up, maybe it was your idea, but you're realizing for this idea to flourish in the long term at an ecosystem level, you, as the initiator, need to give up some control. Or if you're a participant, you need to ask for that control or some of that control from the initiator, and you need to actually democratize it. And where we see that happen, we see a much higher degree of trust amongst the participants. So as all of you start looking at bilateral, multilateral relationships, if you start hooking into delivery companies and fulfillment organizations, if you start working with data service providers, if you start working with some of your major technology providers, trying to work out how are we going to get the governance right, how are we going to get the right level of trust amongst participants, and also make sure there's a flow and distribution of benefits and costs, are going to be really critical to sustainable success for how you manage that ecosystem collaboration. The final one was a really interesting one, and it was a very small percentage. I was actually surprised to see that there was 9% in the data before, but we are seeing more and more of this. These are organizations that are leaning in to some of the latest Web3 governance regimes that exist. We call that liquid governance. This is where you might, we see a lot more of this in the US, less of it here, but we're seeing Australian organizations start to think about it. This is the scenario where you actually have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of participants working on some kind of Web3 community, and then they may be democratizing ideas, putting up ideas, thinking, oh, this is a great idea, I think so, and they'll put up a proposal and others will vote on it, and if it succeeds, the funds from that whole community will be directed to actually get that proposal up and running. And we're starting to see some forward-looking organizations realizing that that's a source of funds for development and new capabilities, and I'll show you a case study in a second. I'll just give you 3 examples of these. And I said I was obviously sort of tapped into the Salesforce leadership. I think the Salesforce App Exchange is a really interesting one. It's a platform that the Salesforce App Exchange, fun fact, not many of you will know this, but actually predated the Apple Store by 2 years. And Mark Benioff, the co-founder of Salesforce, actually had the trademark for the App Store and gave it to Steve Jobs to use because it was deemed in Salesforce the App Store wasn't quite the right label for an enterprise marketplace. So Salesforce made the call that they were going to go to App Exchange because it was an enterprise marketplace. And App Store, which is much more consumer oriented, was actually transitioned to Apple 2 years later. But the App Store was launched the App Exchange was launched in 2005, App Store 2007. There are over 5,000 separate organizations that develop technologies that are deployed through that marketplace for adoption by across the Salesforce ecosystem. So it's a very significant part of the revenue flow. There are multiple billion-dollar businesses that run on the Salesforce App Exchange and build on the Salesforce platform, which itself is running increasingly on the AWS platform. And so that creates this massive flywheel of economic value. In return, Salesforce provides access to a massive customer base, access to skills and resources, training for those skills and resources, and financial incentivizations to make sure that the revenue flows actually move to all of the participants. And it's $1 trillion economy in its own right. And so that's a good example when we looked at a number of sustained long-term alpha governance models. Thought actually that's a pretty good one. And it actually demonstrates a lot of the behaviors you expect of a alpha governor. An entity which is seen to be distributing value back to the participants and is quite transparent around how they are making decisions around investing in the platform. This one was very close to my heart. This is an example of representative governance. I was the CEO at the RBA, CTO before then. Some of you may be familiar with Mambo, me and my bank online. I was at Westpac, 10 plus years earlier. A failed attempt by the industry to provide real-time payments between banks. The second effort, the new payments platform, came with more nudging from the RBA, but what they did differently is they created a central authority, the new payments platform authority, which is constituted by 11 of the major financial institutions. You can see their logos up there, including the regulator or the chair of the Council of Financial Regulators, which is the RBA. And as a consortium, as a representative authority entrusted to govern the launch and delivery of that capability, it was very successful. In terms of per capita pickup and adoption across the economy, the Australian NPP is the fastest growing real-time interbank settlement infrastructure in the world. It wasn't the first to market, but it's increasingly considered one of the best to market. And the governance model behind it is increasingly seen as a fantastic case study. Interestingly, the RBA's participation, like I hinted before, was a great way of having the other parties willing to participate and share information. Another key requirement and finding of this was the establishment of a social contract at the very beginning of the governance, where an informal contract was established around how the governing parties would act when they were governing on behalf of the MPP. in that they would make very conscious efforts and will judge each other on their making of decisions which are in the benefit of the whole economy and for the purpose of the MPP rather than their individual organisations. That was actually a social contract that was nutted out over about 6 months before it went into full delivery. Another interesting thing, and this is a little side note, is that the RBA withdrew from the governance of the MPP after it was fully operational. And that was kind of an innovative innovation, which a number of other national real-time payment infrastructures are now looking at. The reason being that it's very hard for the regulator to be in the operational governance of something like this because you're actually regulating it as well. And so the regulator said, look, we've done our job, we've initiated it, we've seeded it, we've got everyone together, we've got it up and running, it's working, and we're going to step back and now we're going to regulate from the outside. And so now it is a self-governed authority run by the industry and regulated by the regulators. An increasingly useful prototype of representative governance, and there's a number of other major initiatives happening in Australia, including recent fraud and scams initiatives, which traverse, like I said, telcos, retailers and banks, which are starting to lean into this model of governance. And my encouragement is that we're also seeing a lot of smaller organisations thinking about this model of governance. It's much better for trust, much better for value distribution and overall sustainability of the ecosystem. I'll give you very quickly an example of Web3. Wolfram is a company, it's a private company led by Stephen Wolfram, very fascinating individual, billionaire genius in his own right, has been in the industry for many, many years. And Wolfram powers a lot of technology on the internet. It powered the initial launch of Siri, as an example. What Wolfram had done is quite fascinating. They've looked at the Web3 community and said the Web3 community is a fantastic source of capital investment. And so what they are doing is they put up submissions for AI development for their products and services. The Web3 community, in this case, a community called Cardano, actually votes. And increasingly, Wolfram is very effective at knowing what it takes to have a successful proposal in this community. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people use their Web3 tokens to actually vote often in favour of Wolfram's proposals, which have provided an invaluable source of funding and expertise for Wolfram now to bootstrap and release a whole bunch of AI capabilities into their products. And so, interesting example, a really nice way for companies to dabble in Web3 without necessarily being a Web3 deployer, but actually using Web3 as a means of funding and sourcing development for digital services. I'll put it out there because I think we're going to see more and more of that. So I think we looked at some of these results before, really interested to see, I think, representative governance, and I think it is very quickly getting traction in the marketplace, and I think it's probably not a coincidence. It coincides with the increased prevalence of ecosystems as a source of value for organizations. I think they go hand in hand. 3 takeaways for you. I think these were the key things from the research to this point. Increasing transparency of logic and actions is going to go a long way towards building trust and confidence in how an ecosystem's been run. Broadening governance participation. Welcoming, in some cases, your competitors, but certainly your collaborators into governance decision-making. It can take more time, it can be a little more painful, we all know that, but ultimately the benefit is something which has got much more consensus and agreement and is considered to be much more sustainable over time by all of the participants rather than just the one that may be initiating it. And then finally, and this is such a critical one, if you look at failures that we've seen like Maersk, make sure that the costs are distributed, there's transparency around that, and very importantly, like we saw with Bayer, make sure that the value does go to the participants. So there's actual real value for participating, giving up data, you get something back in return, and that creates that sort of flywheel effect which grows ecosystem value.